Hello and welcome on my session about making your work life easier using Citrix Workspace. My name is Hollands Kroon. I'm a principal consultant for Rawworks working in the Netherlands. So, without further ado, let's dive right in because we only have 25 minutes and a lot of content to cover. So, first thing is the agenda. I want to talk to you about the session goals I have for the session, a little bit about the background, and then dive straight into the nitty-gritty because, well, we don't have much time and there's a lot to tell. So we're going to start building a workspace portal, how we can make it smarter, and some tips and tricks that might help you speed things up and do not make the same mistakes that I made. So the session goals is I want to show you how Citrix Workspace can make the life of your users easier. And I want to show you some tips about how you can start implementing this, some ideas on how to make it smarter, and of course some tips and tricks. So let's start with the background. So this presentation is based on the Citrix Innovation Award case we won at Citrix. So it's Hollands Kroon is a Dutch municipality, and they have about 300 users, 400 users, and they had a Windows Server 2012 R2 environment that needed spicing up. So it was all that needed to be replaced. And they had some wishes and needs from the business, and they were, well, users need to feel empowered by IT, of course. We need to help the users be more productive and make the most of the IT tools given to them. There will be no investment in local hardware, so everything must be cloud-based. It has to work with Microsoft Azure because most of their stuff was already in Microsoft Azure and Office 365. Talking about the mail, some files. There are a lot of SaaS, PaaS apps. A lot of SaaS apps, they were using PaaS for some of their workloads. So Microsoft Azure was the way to go. User experience is key, as always. So the user needs to be helped in their daily work, and it needs to be better than it was. Another thing was to do more locally, more disconnected. So one of the things they had is they had a Citrix environment, and everybody needs to have a live internet connection on their device wherever they were to do at least some of the work. And because the municipality of Hollands Kroon doesn't have real offices where they work more where they want and where they need. They have places where you can book a meeting room to discuss, but they don't have desks, a lot of desks. So people needed to do more without having a direct connection to the internet. One of the other things is get more done and be more efficient when the user works, of course, and it should be the same for all the users. So that gave us the cool opportunity to create a new solution for them. So the business goal was that the municipality of Hollands Kroon wanted to transform their outdated workspace into a result-based performance-based workplace, and where location, time, and how work got done no longer affected day-to-day life. So when you look at the picture, that's not a prison you're looking at, that's a meeting room that you can book, and that's the pad for booking the meeting, or you can see what meeting there is. You can also book it online, of course. So no worries, they're still free to go whenever they want. So looking at that, what did we do? We led to a transition towards a Citrix workspace to ease employee experience and streamline a disconnected digital environment. So that's a cool thing to do. So what we did is we will start building the portal, and the first thing we did is we asked a lot of questions. So first thing you want to know is, okay, if the users log on, what are they going to use to authenticate to? Is it, in this case, Azure Active Directory, or it could be Okta or whatever for further authentication, but you need to know what's the authentication source of truth. What apps and data need to be integrated in the portal. So we need to know what needs to be available in the portal for the users. So what apps can be converted to SaaS or PaaS? So a lot of their applications were already SaaS based, but not all of them. So we created, we inventorized what needs to be changed. What to do with the legacy? There are always these old applications that you need to have that only are that you only need to look into to get some old information. So what we're going to do about those applications, and when do they need to be available? So that's the next point. What apps need to be available in what scenario? What apps need to be available when you're not connected to the internet? What apps need to be available when you're not at an office site? Etc. So those are things you want to know beforehand before you start building it, so you can build the optimum solution. So what apps can we connect via API and how? So because Citrix Workspace portal, of course, has microapps, and that's the golden ticket, as far as I'm concerned, for building the next level workplace, is what apps do we have an API, and what can we connect to, and what information can we retrieve, and how? So, and then of course, except for besides what apps and data need to be integrated in the portal, what about the data? What about all the data? And what about security, of course? Because when you're making a workspace that's not, when you have everything in the workplace, in a data center, and you connect through a remoting protocol, it's easy to keep all the data internally. But once you work with a disconnected workplace where the data is everywhere, on client devices, whatever, the question remains, how about security? How are we going to keep things tight? How are we going to keep the data in our IT environment, and not that we don't find the information on the internet or places we don't want it? So after all these questions, we had some steps for building the portal. So first thing is define the goal. So you need to know what you're building it for, how people are going to use it, and when you're going to get to the end result. So another thing is define a roadmap for every application that needs to be available. So what we did is we inventorized all the applications. Okay, this one can go. This one needs to be available. It's a client server application. It's old. It needs to be available as a Citrix published app because data and or the application and the database need to be close together. So we did that for all the applications. Now, then we created a blank workspace, so that we could test authentication, etc., and we could then slowly merge applications in it and migrate applications to where we wanted. And we did it in such a way that we could say, okay, well, we're going to use this group of people as the base, as the first test group, and these apps and data needs to be available for them to do their work and make it a valid test. So. Then the next step is test, because if you work in a Citrix environment for 10 years, and then you're going to do things a lot different, then you need to be very sure that it all works as the users want and as the business requires it. Well, and that's all it's all working, then the next step would be the stage user migration, where you're going to look at, okay, how we're going to get all these users and all this data of these users in the new workspace portal, and how we're going to make it easy for them to migrate. So they had a lot of laptops that need to be redeployed again. They had a lot of data that need to be moved. It was a real complex thing, but in the end it worked. So that's cool. So that gave us a design that's similar to this. So the Citrix, the HK user, the Hollands Kroon user, logs on to the Hollands Kroon portal. It's a Citrix workspace portal where they are where they can have all their applications, so their SaaS apps, their internal web apps, some legacy client server applications. Then there was an express route from their existing data center to Azure, where we use structured event automation to automate the deployment of the Citrix VDAs, where all the legacy apps would be running, FX Logic for the profiles, of course, and some other things, Citrix Fast for the connections, and we for the authentication, and we use OneDrive and SharePoint for the and connected them through content collaboration, so the user had one place where all his data, his own data, and the data of its department was. So this gives you an overview on how everything was looking for the customer. So the customer, the user, only had one place where all the information was, where all his applications was, where everything was he needed to do, and the rest was all in the cloud and available for them. So that gives you, in the end, gives you a workspace that you're that's really cool. So okay, workspace, job done. But no, now the fun part begins, because now you're going to look at making the portal smarter. So this is the tricky part for us, as for me at least, as an old school IT pro, because you have to talk to the business, and not the IT business, but the actual business. So if you look, if you're going to make the portal smarter, you have to discuss with the business what their needs are. What are things that they find repetitive, so they have to do a lot of times a day. Things they find time consuming, things they find annoying to do. See if we can automate those things to make their life easier and make our users more happy, which is the goal of every project, if you ask me. So those are things you have to discuss with your with the business. So us IT folks need to put on a different hat and talk to different people, because Well, one of the things we did at this customer is we automated the onboarding of users. So there was a time-consuming process they had. It took them 30 minutes to an hour for each account they created because they had to add it to different groups. They had to find a user that was similar to the one they had, etc. So that's all a lot of work to get the user in the correct groups, get them connected to the correct manager, get the correct licensing in place. So they had to do this 6 times a week. So that's 3 to 6 hours of work every week. So what we did is we built microapps and automation to create to bring this down to 30 minutes a week. So that sounds like a cool thing, but it's a complex thing, because the first thing is you need to start to talk with the business to see, okay, but what's happening? What's the flow for when someone is going to be onboarded? So HR has to do something, the manager has to do something, IT has to do something, the facility department has to do something, get a phone, etc. So everybody there are a lot of departments that need to do something to get this user onboarded. So what we did with the people from Hollands Kroon, and they already had a lot of this in place, thankfully, so that saved a lot of time, is we looked at, okay, but how does this process work from the lady at HR or the man at HR typing in the username or typing in the name and all the things that's needed to create the contract, to the deployment of the laptop to the user, and all the steps in between. So we created flows for that to see, okay, but what part can we automate and what part doesn't go well. And one of the things we found out is, well, what they do now is copy the group memberships of one user to another user, as a lot of companies do. But we needed to rebuild that to say, okay, well, we created functions, and all that functions were a list of groups. And when a new employee is onboarding, he's going to be in one of these function groups, and that gives him this batch of licensing, Active Directory rights, NTFS rights, whatever. So you have a fixed box. And if he has another function group, we can add that. And for example, say he is, besides being a financial man, he also does something in Dutch it's called ondernemingsraad, but in the council for the business. So then he also needs a different function group added, so he gets extra groups added. So that makes it a lot easier for users to be onboarded, because that doesn't mean you have to do it manually, but then you can automate it. So how does that look? We created a micro app that says, okay, well, add a user to the Active Directory on the left. On the right side, you can fill in some credentials for the user. So the first name, last name. You can say who is the manager and which department it's going to be. And then, if needed, the date on which the contract ends. So, and then you can click on add the user. And that works like a charm, because then it's automatically created. But microapps works on an API-based manner, and Hollands Kroon uses Active Directory, which is still on-prem with Azure AD Connect to the cloud. So the source of record, the base source of the authentication source of record is Active Directory, which is in the data center of Hollands Kroon, as of now. Not in the future, but as of now. So then you need to build something that can talk to Active Directory. But Active Directory doesn't have a standard API. So what we did, we'd like to thank our partners. So of course, Citrix Workspace, API Manager, Azure Logic Apps, Azure Automation, PowerShell, and Active Directory. So what we did is we built something, and I can show you in this picture, where the user fills something in the Workspace UI on the top. It's fed into the microapps platform. And what we then did is, once you click the button, there is a URL that's fed into an Azure Logic app through Azure Automation. That gets this information, puts them in the correct order, fills them in a PowerShell script, and that is run on an Azure hybrid worker in the Active Directory domain of the customer. So what that does is, what this in Ascension does, is you can run scripts in the Active Directory in the environment of the customer, and that gives you the freedom to do virtually anything you want. So by doing this and capturing the output of the PowerShell script and feeding it back into the microapps platform and back into the workspace UI, you can see if a user was created successfully, and if not, if something went wrong. And okay, then we needed to look in the backend in the Logic app or the API or the automation, Azure automation, to check, hey, what went wrong. But the assumption is you can almost talk to any application, and an API is no longer necessary, but it's optional. So that's cool. So why is this so cool? You can connect to on-premises data and apps by using the Azure Hybrid Worker to do a lot of things. And you don't need to expose it directly to the internet, because the Azure Hybrid Worker runs in the company's environment, and it does pull requests to the Azure backend to ask, do you have a task for me to do? And they say, yeah, I got something for you. And then it reports back. So it only needs a 443 outbound connection, not an inbound connection. So that makes it really also safe. But you have to think a lot about security on your Logic app side, because if you say, well, anyone that knows the correct web URI or the web URL can fire at it, then there could be a lot of users created in your Active Directory that you don't want, or deleted, if because one of the things we added later was also the automatic removal of users from Active Directory or something like that. So the security part is not on the data center side or the internal network side, but it is on how to confine and secure the Azure, the Logic apps on the front end of in the Azure side. So that's something that you need to really think about, is the security of the Logic apps part. But the fun part is API is not required. So thinking out of the box, you could talk directly to an Oracle database to put data in it and get data out of it, without talking to the application that puts data in the Oracle database or gets it out. The only thing is, it makes it complex and tough for legal or support for whatever reason. For example, if you break the Oracle database and it's because you scripted against it and you broke a table, well, the support is going to have the support of the application vendor is going to have a field day with that, and they're gonna make it they could make it a bit complex for you to get it fixed, maybe expensive. So be sure you know what you do when you're scripting against databases, etc. But for Azure Active Directory, or for an internal Active Directory, PowerShell is the way to go. So it's not that complex, and it's not that time consuming to fix it. So that's why I put in the picture of the playground. If you know this, then it can be a playground, because then you can not only implement SaaS, PaaS, or whatever, and with microapps talk with everything with an API. You can also talk to things without an API, and that makes it really cool. So let's talk a bit about the session goals. Citrix Workspace can make your life easier. We talked a bit about tips on start and implementing, some ideas on how to make it smarter. So I only focused on one idea because there's only limited time and a lot of things to tell. But the last thing I want to give back to you are some tips and tricks. And that's the final part. So tips and tricks for making the bridge fit and not building it next to each other. So on the business side, we as IT folk need to talk to other people in the organization. So be prepared to talk the business talk. Know what your customer has for issues. Know how you can help him make his work life easier, better, and more efficient, and how he can make his user be more efficient and be more happy. But this requires a different skill set. If I look at myself, I'm an IT pro, and I'm a bit older, as you can see. The skill set changed over the years, from talking as an IT guy to another IT guy. Okay, what do you want to do? To talking to an HR manager or a finance professional or someone else in the organization about, okay, how can I help you make your life better, your work life better? So some tips and tricks for on the technical side of you. These are mostly from my own experience, that Citrix microapps is not for the mouse clicking professional. I found that building microapps, and especially when you're building it using logic apps, Azure API Manager, etc., is get real complex, and it's going to require a lot of scripting. So it's not click, 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 next, finish. So you need to adopt new technologies and learn scripting and thinking in different ways than used to. Another tip is start small, so don't build the entire castle. Start by building the foundation. That's something I learned the hard way, that if you start too big, you're never going to get it finished, and you have so much loose ends, you don't know when you're going to get it finished. Another thing is that once you click something in the micro app, or in the Citrix Workspace portal, the micro app, and you change some settings, those are not always instantaneously live, because of course it's the cloud, so it needs to evolve, it needs to be deployed everywhere, so it may take a while. So if it doesn't work, just wait a bit. If you change something, it doesn't work, just wait a bit and try it again in a few minutes, and it just might work. It saves you the hassle of changing it, doesn't work, changing it again, doesn't work, changing it again, doesn't work, change it, drink a cup of coffee, come back, and it works. Trust me. Okay, one other thing is Citrix has a copy of the last sync. So if you use, for example, if you're going to use some of the settings where you use a data loader in Citrix Workspace to get a copy of the data. So when a user clicks on a button, it instantaneously shows the information. That means Citrix has a copy of that data in their cloud somewhere. But it's in Azure, and it's really safe, and they also have a lot of certifications for that, so that's safe, but it's good to know. If you don't do that, when a user clicks on an application, it might take 20 to 30 seconds for the data to be retrieved from the backend system and then shown in the portal. So that's not something that will enhance the user experience. So that also means that the data shown to the user is not real time, except when you're using webhooks, because when you click on a webhook, it gets the information. So that's why webhooks mostly are a bit slower, because it has to get the information. But as said, if you're using a data loader to get the information from another portal, so for example, you use ServiceNow integration and you cache some of the data locally, that data is shown, and it's not the last version of the data that's in the database of ServiceNow. So you have to, when using the syncs, you have to take that into account, that that the data is always lagging a bit. So one of the other things we found out is API changes. So when you're using APIs with your customers, there's a lot of issues with application vendors changing their APIs and not telling you, or not telling the customer. So that gives you some issues on why the beep is the thing not working. So when this is happening, always check the vendor to see if there are API changes. And of course, watch out for expiring authentication tokens, because when you connect to the API of a customer, there is possibly some authentication that needs to take place, and it could expire at any time if not implemented correctly. And then your data that you show in your workspace will only get older and older. So, once again, the session goals, we talked about how Citrix Workspace can make your life of you and your users easier. So I hope I gave you some tips and tricks on that. We gave you some tips on starting the implementation, ideas on how to make it smart, and of course the tips and tricks. So I hope this helped you a little bit in your journey into the Citrix Workspace. It's a real cool thing, and well, if you need any more help, please let me know, and I hope to see you soon in real life. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye.